Thank you. Please stand by.
And I will be your host for today's event. Before we get started, I want to cover a few housekeeping items. First, everyone's phone lines have been placed on mute to eliminate background noise, and we ask everyone to stay on mute to eliminate disruptions. If you have a question during the presentation, we ask you to submit through the Q&A module of the WebEx, and we will address them during the presentation if there is an appropriate pause, or at the end of the session during the question and answer portion. Lastly, the slides and recording of this event will be mailed to you after the event. That is all I have for you, and I will pass on to Chris Dowes and Matt Baker, who will be your presenters today. Chris and Matt?
Thank you, Kristen. This is Matt Baker from GP Strategies. I represent our Performance Readiness Solutions group within GP. And from an ERP perspective, we focus on enabling our customers, end users, to better leverage and utilize their ERP systems and applications across the enterprise. I've been with GP Strategies for about 8 years, and thank you for joining our webinar today. Chris?
Yeah, thanks, Matt. This is Chris Dowse. I'm from NeoChange. Excited to be here with Matt today. We are focused on user adoption. We've been working on the challenges of user adoption, especially around products, large enterprise apps, for quite some time now, 10+ years, and I'm excited to have an opportunity to talk to you today about some of the insights from our latest adoption insight report. So this is our 4th survey that we've done. We do one every 2 years. And I think just to set the context of what we were looking for when we did this survey, we got 300 different companies to participate. You know, a lot has changed in the last 20 years as it relates to enterprise apps. We've seen this proliferation of features, you know, a factor of 10,000, Moore's Law, I guess, applies to features as well as computing processing. And then we've seen a number of more users come into the business environment. Today, applications are much more dependent on users than they ever have been. Front office apps, social analytics, you know, very different to our back-end processing of back in the early 90s. And so really, with all these new users coming in and all these new features coming in, the expectation was that, you know, returns on IT would be greater, but that hasn't been happening. So we were curious then to look into why was that not happening, and what could we learn from the 300 companies that participated. So Matt, I'll have you move forward. You know, the first thing that we found, as I said, we've been tracking effective usage rates of technology for some time. Effective usage is our proxy for the value that software delivers. And this was the first year that we hadn't seen an actual improvement in effective usage in our survey. And really, when we looked into that, it wasn't a function of company size, it wasn't a function of whether a company was a growth company or, you know, looking to just reduce its operational costs. What we had happen in 2010, 2011 was this unprecedented investment in information technology. A lot of people don't understand that on the other side of the main part of the recession, we had this significant catch-up in investment. And really, so with all these new apps, all these new investments coming in, excuse me, a little cold there, you know, users themselves were quite overwhelmed. So we'll move on, Matt. And on the other side of this, excuse me, consumption problem, excuse me, we found that companies on average were losing about 17% of their users' time. And really, when we looked into that, it was a factor of, you know, the process workflow, a lack of training. But at 17%, that was really like giving our users effectively 1 day off a week. And to put that in context, you know, at 17%, 1 day a week, really, excuse me, the value of lost wages there was essentially greater than the entire 100% of tech spend in these companies. So that was quite a major finding for this survey. I'll get you to go on that. Okay. So what we're looking at now is an overall summary of, you know, the service model of the participants. And what you're looking at is the further that the wedges go out, the more mature the service is. excuse me. So what you can see here is really we've got this classic outdated service model, a situation where you know, a dependence on the help desk and self-service, maybe a splash of communications, but services like super user programs and user monitoring, not so much. And so really, this was the state of the industry. And what we felt then, you know, this is really what we had to change. If we were going to get past this unprecedented investment in consumption, then really what we were looking at here is what aspect of this service model had to change. And so I think we'll move forward, Matt. The big insight, I think, out of the players that were doing really well was, you know, for them, they had transparency into the usage of their systems. So what that really means is they were able to understand exactly who was using what, who was doing well, and so forth. But more importantly, with a modern service model, they were able to integrate this usage transparency with the services that they're delivering. So they were able to connect the impact of their education, the impact of their support, their process KPIs, back to the actual usage of the users. Whereas the companies that weren't doing so well, either A, didn't have the transparency, and definitely didn't have a way to connect it to, you know, all the services that they were delivering. And I think the other thing that stood out here when we dug into this, and we were really talking about less than 10% of the companies, is that, you know, there's been this historical desire to get really efficient at education, really efficient at support, and so those groups themselves go off, do their bit for the user, but maybe not in an integrated fashion. So really they, in some instances, might actually be negating each other. So really this message, this core concept around connecting the usage to an integrated service model was something that the better players were doing very well. So keep moving forward, Matt. So, you know, when we say they were doing well, how do we contextualize what that actually means? And so what you have here is, what we have is a user metabolism matrix. So on the x-axis, we're looking at the productivity of the users, and on the y-axis, we're looking at the effective usage, as we'd asked them before. And so we have people down here in the drag zone, not a place where you want to be living, and people are living in the power zone. In the power zone, there's two things that we need to understand. One, you know, 24% higher business productivity. What that really means is that the return on their investments, the revenue per employee that these companies were achieving was much greater than those in the drag zone. You know, in the power zone, these service providers were doing much better in terms of, you know, their customer satisfaction. 5 times the amount of satisfied users, raving fan users, sorry, than the drag zone. And so what we wanted to figure out then, besides this concept of them moving to the integrated service model, you know, really what were they doing? What were they really doing differently, and what could we learn from that? So Matt, roll forward. So there was 3 things that really stood out. We've touched on one already, but the first was really this concept of investing heavily in user empowerment. And so what that really meant was, when we think back to the service picture that we had earlier, is that concepts around proactive education, proactive support, looking at super user programs where you're actually matching, you know, the best users with the laggards. You know, the leaders were already ahead there in the sense that they were investing much more in user empowerment. There were players that were doing okay without doing that, but they were doing it at a high cost on the back of the users. The second, and we'll talk about sort of how big of an investment difference a little bit ahead. The other aspect is that, you know, as we were talking about just earlier, they're really sharing that usage insight. So it's not common for all groups to have insight into the usage patterns and the impact of their services. So in this situation, these companies might have had siloed education, siloed support, but they were still able to share that usage insight across the different service players. And then in terms of, you know, what other finding, you know, a lot of people think of investments in users, training and so forth happening at the point of deployment, even after deployment. But really the leaders in the power zone They started working adoption and sustainment right from the beginning of their projects, and we'll talk about sort of what kind of returns that they got from that. But essentially, they weren't waiting till user acceptance testing to figure out what exactly was going to happen from an adoption perspective. And we'll get you to move forward, Matt.
Thanks, Chris. And to Chris's last point, as far as really starting at the right phases of the project from a sustainability, focusing on the end user aspect of things. As we all know, the challenge really is fivefold. From some of the key outcomes, we've discovered budget is a primary challenge, and from a budget perspective, can we, as the folks supporting our end user base, really showcase a return on investment for training dollars? And how do we quantify how well our users are actually utilizing and leveraging the system in the way it was designed and intended to be utilized? Another key challenge is executive leadership and sponsorship. I think from a lot of projects that we've seen over the years, training ramps up in support of a go-live, but as time goes on, training really becomes more of an afterthought, and over the longer term, that really enables the end users to suffer from a performance perspective and a performance support perspective. Aligning the needs of the IT business and other units within the organization, this is really one of the key critical pieces. Things just don't stop at go live. If that's the case, a lot of times you're going to show a similar glide path as what we're looking at here on our slide, in the fact that things move relatively well through go live and shortly after go live, but the longer time goes on, the overall performance of the end users continues to degrade. Process management and improvement. So from an overall sustainment effort, how does the organization really support process change? How are those managed? How are those improved? And how are those disseminated out to the organization to ensure that the end user base has the requisite knowledge to actually leverage the system in the newly changed process format? Continuous training and performance support. As Chris indicated, this is really one of the key cornerstones for ensuring your user base can actually leverage the system and use the system in the desired and intended manner. And then from an ownership perspective, when we talk about true sustainment of an application, especially from an end user perspective, who are really the right owners? Is it IT? Is it the business? In a lot of cases, it's certainly a combination of both to ensure, again, that the end users are being supported and are in line with the objectives of both not just IT, but also the business. When we talk about the notion of ERP sustainment, there's four key areas to really consider and put some emphasis and focus. The first and primary one certainly is the people. So do they have the capabilities and are they aligned to the direction of the project, whether it be an upgrade, whether it be a config change? Do they have the requisite know-how and knowledge to find ongoing training, and how are they being supported from a long-term perspective? Communication, how are folks from an end-user perspective being communicated to? Are they enabled to understand what system changes are going to occur from a long-term roadmap perspective? And if there's a short-term immediate change that does occur, how is that communicated out to the folks actually using the system in order to make sure that they understand what that change is, they understand why that change is occurring, and most importantly, they understand how to navigate that change within the system and the overall process. And last but not least on the people side is certainly super users. So some folks call this center of excellence, super user community. Sometimes it's called a community of practice. But where are your most critical end users, and how can you better leverage those particular individuals to better support the overall end user population as a whole? From a business perspective, obviously governance is really one of the critical items. How do you manage the ongoing sustainment of the system in support of your end user base? How do you measure that from a goals and a metrics perspective? What is the overall ERP roadmap? And then from a project management office perspective, what are those key things that are done on a daily, weekly, and monthly basis to ensure that the organization is fully supporting those folks that are actually using the system. From a process perspective, obviously managing process changes is really critical to ensuring your user base can effectively use the system, and more importantly, can understand the upstream and downstream impacts of system changes. From a process ownership perspective, who is actually in charge of owning not only the process change and ensuring that that's seen all the way through to completion from a system perspective, but then how does that translate down to the end users so they understand what those changes are. And then again, from a continuous improvement perspective, uplifting the folks who use the system, i.e. your end user population, to provide unsolicited feedback to really help the business as well as IT look to make the system better, look to make it more efficient, and look to point out inconsistencies that typically create some unneeded work or prolong a particular process within the application. And the last is the enabling technology piece. So whether it is SAP, whether it's Oracle, at the end of the day, whether it's data, new functionality, interactions with the help desk, all these things all need to be really focused from an end user perspective to ensure that when folks need help, they understand where to go. GP Strategies and NeoChange, through the course of our interactions with our clients, really have more of an outcomes-based approach. These are some of the key bullets that we really focus on with any of our interactions with our clients. But at the end of the day, we really want to enable our clients to really experience the ROI as well as the lowering of their total cost of ownership through better utilization of the system by enabling the end user base. Systems are obviously a key aspect of this in any organization, but training in the end users are in many cases an afterthought. The focus is typically on the technology, but as I just stated a moment ago, obviously the systems are only as good as those that use them. The next is maintain and improve competence. So how do we deliver training really at the point of need, especially after go live? Folks don't need to be hauled into a 2-day course. They really just need those 30-second sound bites, maybe a job aid in order to help them understand what the new process is or what the new process change might be. From a governance perspective, there has to be a partnership between IT and the business. And this is really one of the critical things that I think between Chris and myself we've seen time and time again. In order for the system to truly be set up and used and leveraged in the most desirable manner, IT and business, they really have to be aligned at all times and have to be wholly bought into the roadmap for the long term. Key business metrics, things really have to be owned, managed, and maintained for the long haul. And from an end user perspective, this is really critical from providing the ability for the end user population to provide feedback, to understand what our system performance goals are, how do you measure and quantify what's working and what's not, and then how do you, more importantly, take action upon that. From a processes and a structures perspective, how do we develop a sustainable model that supports the effective utilization of our system for the long term that ultimately ends up delivering better trained and more competent end users. And that's really where our key focus is. From a GP Strategies perspective, as we partner with NeoChange on these types of opportunities, we really start from a performance targets perspective. And we help really devise these performance targets through working with NeoChange as NeoChange collects and identifies through data analysis where the challenge areas may lie within your end user population. GP then partners with NeoChange to incorporate that into an overall blueprint which really describes kind of a recommended path forward or mitigation plan to really focus at that point of need from an end user population perspective. A lot of, from a GP strategies capabilities perspective, some of these mitigation strategies may include a variety of different aspects. So there could be some change management. Issues may arise that are solely focused and identified as a learning issue. So there might be additional training or different training that needs to occur. It could be as simple as a performance support problem. So after your users leave the training course or classes, how are they supported back at their desks? And if they run across an issue where they're not supported, who do they contact to find out what the answer is to that particular question? From a collaboration perspective, how do we support and foster and nurture an environment where collaboration is really a key part of driving the system utilization forward? So how can we better enable our end users to be more proactive about providing feedback, to coordinate with one another, maybe on some tips and tricks that they've learned, and how do we, as an organization, really position our system in the best manner possible? We talked about leadership earlier, but that could be yet another key potential aspect of our solution. After the solution's been delivered, we want to put together a means and a mechanism to measure what the increased performance is based on that mitigation strategy, with the ultimate outcome of trying to continuously improve and sustain the performance improvements that we've identified through NeoChange and through GP through those mitigation strategies. This just further elaborates on what some of the key service offerings may look like post-identifying challenge areas. So it could be, again, anything from change management, could be full end-to-end end-user training, whether it's development of content, whether it's taking existing content and modifying that to meet system configuration changes, could be a performance support strategy, could be additional user analytics. So how do we continually dig into the system to monitor how folks are progressing once a mitigation strategy has been put into place? Developing the super user network. So how do we develop a program that truly supports the needs, desires, and ultimate long-term objectives of the end user population as it relates to the system? Knowledge transfer. So that's really one of the key things and core beliefs of GP as well as NeoChange is we really want to share with our clients and really teach and enable them to be self-sustaining for the long run. And that really manifests itself through our sustainment offerings. So based on the recommended approach and based on our interactions with our clients, some of the expected results from employing a sustainment strategy would really be to see continual ongoing learning, continual process improvement, and across the board, to a larger extent, continually refining and enhancing of skill sets within the end user population in order for the system to continually be monitored, managed, and ultimately serve the needs of the business. Because at the end of the day, obviously, clients are implementing softwares to become more efficient, to become more effective. And if systems are not managed to meet those needs, obviously that's a large cost issue and ramifications if they don't meet those objectives. So from a sustainment strategy perspective, again, we want to achieve those business outcomes. We want to see a tighter knit approach as it relates to the business and IT. And we really want to develop a standardized approach that really enables lower total cost of ownership and at the same token, being able to quantify what potential ROI may be involved with putting together training and mitigation strategies. Chris?
Yeah, so I think, we talked about this being a conversation around crowding out and sort of how do we as providers, internal or external, do the best job that we can. And really, the first thing that the power users were doing, as we talked about earlier, people in the power zone, is really that they were able to evidence their performance. So that, one of the first steps to being able to, get more funding is actually prove your impact. And so this really did show up in terms of the low performers in the drag zone, getting, putting 6-7% of their application budgets towards investments in education, investments in support, whereas the high performance players, much higher, almost 12%. So that's a pretty big differential. And we can debate, whether it's a chicken or the egg, in the sense that if you invest more, you get a better, you get a better result. That is obviously true, but it was more than that, because I think we talked about the concept of the usage insight. But really, this whole concept of if you can evidence your worth and evidence your impact, then you have a better chance of making the argument for getting more funding. Keep moving forward, Matt. Part of evidencing your worth and evidencing your value, so we talked about this concept of metabolism, the user efficiency on the x-axis, the level of consumption of features on the y-axis, and how well they're being used. And so there's an economic value with that we can move way beyond sort of a survey down to the actual level of usage and the individual users. So what you're looking at here is an actual matrix from one of our clients, where each of those dots is an individual user, an SAP user in this instance. And we have about 9,000 users here. And so we've put an economic value on, if we could, if we were all robots and we all were fully trained and we never made a mistake, then we would operate at 100%. So all these dots would be over to the right. And with that kind of efficiency, we would use a lot more of an application, but that's just not realistic. So what we tend to do is focus our clients on, how do they move 5 percentage points of efficiency, and really then what's the economic value of that. And so in this instance, 5% doesn't sound like a lot, 5% improvement in user productivity, but in this instance, with the number of users that we have, that's worth $6 million based purely on the wages of the employees. It says nothing to the increased benefits of getting better usage, reinvesting that efficiency into using more sophisticated capabilities, and investing into making more power users, get you in that top right zone, in the power zone. So the message here, though, is basically putting an economic value, and as part of the joint offer that Matt was referring to, that's what we're trying to get clients able to do, is get them in a situation where they can prove their worth. It's hard to do good service today, let alone great service. And I think, having the measure of your impact is the first step. So we'll move on that. We talked earlier about, the power zone players and when they start investing in these programs. You can see there, those that waited until implementation of the actual technology still get a decent return on their investment, but really those in the power zone that started back in the discovery phase are getting 3 times the level of returns on their user programs. So a lot of debate over the years. How much change management do you do up front? What time do you do training and so forth? But the point here is that user sustainment work should be starting in the beginning of the project. And that shows itself in the results of the 300 companies here, where, a 300% higher return on those investments by starting earlier. So keep moving forward, Matt. Matt, I'll throw this one back to you since my voice is struggling.
Okay. Thanks, Chris. So with that, we would like to present our joint offering to the attendees on the phone today. And really the concept is completely aligned with what we've laid out here today on our webinar. It's a 6-week engagement, and for the first 4 weeks, the NeoChange team is able to actually come in, begin collecting end-user utilization data. And for the first 4 weeks, we collect and then begin to actually process that data. The last 2 weeks of the offering, GP comes in and collectively, combined with NeoChange, conducts a discovery session with the client, and we actually develop, based on the findings from NeoChange, we actually develop a recommended end-user training OCM strategy based on the areas of need pointed out through NeoChange's analytics outputs. And at the end of this, the idea really is to provide our clients with a go-forward pathway based on actual system data through, again, the NeoChange analytics that is based solely and grounded solely on that data and really focused at the point of need, and really enables our clients to really have a clear understanding of what the solution needs to look like in order to remedy the specific problems that have been identified. So the cost is $25,000 fixed price. Any additional travel that may be required would be above and beyond that. So with that, Chris, anything additional to add from the Blueprint offering?
Yeah, I think people always ask, where's the usage data going to come from? And so if you've got a major enterprise application and you're a service provider in your organization, chances are you have data today, but you just can't make sense of it. So I think, the 4 weeks of collection is in a situation where you don't have the data. Quite often we find that, people have, sometimes great big stores of usage data and their help desk data. So I think, if you have something today, we can process that and maybe we can get it done a bit quicker. But, if not, then, with the major apps, we would do that collection process. I think, just to reiterate what I had said before and sort of the echoing of the survey that we had done last year, that the ability to articulate, the level of user productivity and understand exactly where it's a problem is good on a couple of levels. First of all, it's helping you talk the language of executives that will give you investments anyway, so that's quite obvious. But the reality is that even if you're a high performer and you're up to 12% of the app budget, chances are you're still being asked to do too much. And so I think, part of this offer is really, even if you don't get your budget, even if you can't make an argument to get a greater investment from your organization, you'll be able to do things a lot smarter in the short term. So you'll be, whereas you might have, been focused on the squeaky wheels, the people that complain the most, you're going to have some quantifiable data behind why you're going to work a certain process, why you're going to work a certain user population, and that's going to make you much more efficient, with the investments that you have today, let alone, making an argument for more. So that's all I would kind of add there, Matt.
Yeah, Chris, I think that last point really is the key, and that is, from a training perspective, training's obviously the first thing that is typically cut out of any budget from a project perspective. And, this offering really enables, as Chris has indicated, for you to really understand where your problem or pain points really are, and it really enables you to have a path forward that's focused on remedying those particular pain points. So really the outcome of this engagement is the full analytics report out, which will show, by area and potentially down to, from a user perspective, where the key pain points really are. And then based on that data, you'll be presented with, from a training and an end user adoption perspective, the recommended path forward via curriculum map, a project plan, and then recommended training strategy components to really help uplift those particular areas. So with that said, I would like to open up the Q&A portion of the call. So Kristen, do you want to open up the lines for us, please?
Yes, thanks, Chris and Matt. If anyone has a question, please feel free to hit submit through the chat now, or you can hit #6 at this time to unmute your line. I did have a couple come through, so I'll go ahead and give you the first one. How do you measure user productivity and consumption?
I'll take that one, Matt. So, if we go back to the matrix here that we had, that user metabolism matrix. So let's talk about consumption first, which is really the y-axis. What we tend to focus on, depending on the app, is really the number of screens. In SAP, also you have T-codes, so we would measure the number of T-codes, the number of screens, and then you'd be really, you wouldn't expect every user to use the same amount of functionality within a screen, in a process, but we do compare them, relatively speaking, based on the nature of their role, which our analytics can discover. So that's really the y-axis here around consumption. Efficiency is, I guess, a bit more sophisticated, but essentially we look at a number of factors. We're looking at the amount of help requests out of the application. We're looking at the amount of rework, as evidenced by repeating functions over and over again. We look at also the concept of cycle times, either the amount of active time or the amount of time that the user is idling or not engaged with the application relative to their peers. We also look at navigational challenges. So in complex environments, you might have multiple instances of an application. You might access it through, different portals and such. So we look at the navigational aspects. So all of those go into a measure, and we're measuring then, out of the total potential time that a user is in the app, what percentage of that do we think is efficient usage versus an opportunity to improve. So that's the two measures, how we get there.
Okay, I have another one. Can user adoption be measured by process?
I'll take that again, Matt, and you might want to add. Definitely, people have a lot of problems with this idea of how can you basically measure, measure at all, but let alone measure for unique processes from organization to organization. And really the way that works is, in systems that are dedicated to certain processes, it's obvious. But when we have situations where you have complicated applications that can do a number of things, so maybe you have an order-to-cash process that on the one end is all about customer orders, and on the other end it's all about accounts receivable. In that respect, we really focus on the types of functionality that are used and cluster that into different processes. And in that way, then we're able to compare, people that are doing well versus people that are not. So you definitely, want to shape your usage. You don't just want to look at screen hits, for example. You just don't want to look at, error messages on one screen, for example. You want to get it clustered into, the highest point of features that you can that represent a process. So I don't know if you had anything to add to that, Matt?
Yeah, just to add to that, I think the other aspect that we look at jointly too is just to kind of piggyback off of that example Chris used. If we're processing POs or receiving payments or even sending payments, we take a look at are each of these process areas achieving the desired result. So from a receivables perspective, we might be required to, from a client perspective, every 30 days, execute on the receivables. And if we're not adhering to that, then obviously we want to not only take a look at from a system perspective, but also more importantly from a holistic process perspective to hopefully identify where that potential hiccup may be occurring. And then from there, once that has been identified, jointly make some recommendations to rectify whatever that is. So, I think it's certainly not only from a system perspective, but also from, a business pain point perspective, we really need to take a look at the holistic process to really develop the right approach and the right solution.
Okay, I've had one more come through. What would be an example of a leading edge practice for a super user program?
Yeah, I can take this, and Chris, certainly, feel free to chime in. I think there's probably a couple key things from a super user program, to really look at. Understanding from a help desk perspective, are the tickets from the bigger picture perspective, have they increased or decreased? If you truly have a sustainable community practice in place, odds are is they're really going to become your frontline performers and your first line of defense. So you should see a natural decline in help desk tickets. Acceleration of onboarding. So from a power user or community practice perspective, are these power users able to quickly bring people up to speed on the system? And then also, more importantly, as things change and through upgrades, configuration changes, et cetera, are they able to quickly get that out, get the users on board, and really lay out what that path forward looks like? Reduce knowledge leakage. So, effective communities are constantly keeping knowledge and sharing that to keep it alive and making it available. So another good leading indicator is, taking a look at how are the users supported post-training, post-go-live. Is that through some type of technology solution, whether it's a tool such as UPerform or SAP's Workforce Performance Builder? Is that through a SharePoint site? There's a lot of different approaches that meet the needs of the organization, but how are the users from a survey perspective and getting their honest-to-goodness feedback? Do they feel like they're supported? Do they know where to go? These, again, are all leading indicators. And then the biggest thing is, taking a look at the overall training costs. So are folks really focused on developing training solutions to meet the need at hand and not necessarily train for the sake of training? So, can we quantify what the true impacts to the business are through training interventions as opposed to just kind of taking a swag in the dark? So Chris, do you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, I think, if we're talking about super user best practices, super user programs, power user programs, one of the challenges for clients is really to be able to recruit individuals to help support other users. And I think another one of the benefits of baselining is that it's easier to go to a manager and say, look, your group has X% efficiency problem, and we want to recruit 2 of your better users to help the rest of your organization, versus showing up to that same manager and just saying, hey, we want to take the time of one of your people and have them work on helping other users. So I think one of the best practices I'm talking about here is basically making the economic argument to actually recruit and retain people in your super user program, because net, you should be able to make an argument that it's a good investment for the organization, for the manager that they're talking to.
Well, and I think, Chris, to add to that too, I think using that same line of thinking, through this process, you're also able to clearly articulate who some of those more credible users are within the system, right? And obviously there has to be additional layers of criteria leveraged in order to clearly present kind of the role profile for who's going to be the best super user. But again, you can see through kind of the proofs in the pudding of how people are leveraging and using the system. That can be leveraged as a criteria component and a decision-making piece to really identify who the best super users potentially will be.
Okay, that's all I have for questions. Do you guys have anything else you wanted to add for a wrap-up?
Chris?
No, I think I would just echo the theme of, why we're doing this and really why we want people to be successful. And really, if you can evidence the impact of what you're doing, then not only are you going to make a better argument for more investments, I think you're going to get more meaning out of your work. I mean, that's, we all want to believe that the work that we do is important. So I think, the more that we can support, players that are trying to make users successful and make them successful, then that's great. And I think, this is how we tend to start doing that, by giving them this baseline and that economic argument.
Yeah, and I would just add, at the end of the day, as one of our colleagues says, it's not about the technology. So technology should enable and support your learning and collaboration strategy. And, through this process that we've laid out today, that will help make the economic argument for why this is a good approach and why this will positively impact the organization, not only on the short term, but also on the long term. So with that, Kristen, we'll turn it back over to you.
Great. Thank you both. I would like to remind everyone on the phone that the slides and recording will be sent to the email address you provided later this afternoon. And with that, I will just thank everyone for attending, and I hope you all have a wonderful day. Thank you.